With the square of opposition and the relationships of relevance, we've been looking at what you can infer immediately or automatically from certain categorical propositions. And in this video, we're going to look at something new called the syllogism, which involves two propositions that immediately or automatically imply a third conclusion. So as usual, we need to start off with some definitions. So let's get going. Now, an argument is a statement of rational reasons for or against an idea or action with the intent to persuade. And that's different from what we sometimes think of as an argument when people get into an argument. In logic, it's a statement of rational reasons for or against an idea or action with the intent to persuade. And here we've got our little logic friends that pop up, and the green guy says, "You are a cotton-headed ninnymuggins." And the guy in blue says, "And you're a meanie beanie. If you don't stop calling me names, I'm going to beat you up." And the girl in gold is thinking, well, the guy in blue is trying to persuade the guy in green to do something, but his reasoning is not logical. This isn't an argument. It's a verbal fight, right? That's something altogether different from what we're talking about in this video. And she says to them, "Now, you are students who must obey the rules. I am your teacher, in charge of seeing that you do. Stop calling each other names, or I will start calling your parents." And the guy in green's thinking, "Gulp." And the guy in blue's like, "Yikes." And our logic dragon says, now that is a logical argument. See, she's trying to persuade them of something, but she's using rational reasons to do that. Now, a syllogism is a formally arranged argument containing two premises and a conclusion. Okay, that's an important definition to make sure you get into your notes. A syllogism is a formally arranged argument containing two premises and a conclusion. And in fact, we're going to go on with that a little bit. A syllogism must, contain exactly three terms, and it must be arranged in this order: major premise, minor premise, and conclusion. And don't worry, we're going to talk about what all of those things mean in just a moment, but make sure you've got this definition of a syllogism in your notes. Okay, let's make sure we understand a few key terms here, okay? A premise is just a proposition. And in a syllogism, we have two premises or two propositions that lead to a third proposition that we call a conclusion. Okay, so there's really three propositions in the syllogism. All right, the first two are called the premises, and the last one is called the conclusion. Now, a term, you may recall, is simply the subject or the predicate of a preposition. So make sure we're clear on what premises, conclusion, and term actually mean. So let's put that up on our chalkboard here. Term simply means subject or predicate in a proposition. Premise is a proposition that leads to a conclusion. And conclusion is a proposition that follows from a premise. And now we have our little friendly kangaroo and logic dragon that come back in. And kangaroo says, let's try an example. Can you identify the terms of each proposition? And also, can you identify which propositions are the premises and which are the conclusion? And so Logic Dragon starts off and he says, all dragons must be logical creatures because all really cool animals are logical creatures. And everyone knows that all dragons are really cool animals. All right, so we want to see if we can figure out what the terms are, which propositions are the premises, and which one is the conclusion. All right, so let's just write that out in non-dialogue form here. And we've highlighted in red the terms. Right? The terms are dragons, logical creatures, and really cool animals. If you look at that, on all those words, there really are only three terms, right? Three things that are being used as either a subject or a predicate. Now, we go ahead and put in some green brackets here, and we see that we have three propositions. All dragons must be logical creatures. That's one proposition. All really cool animals are logical creatures. That's another proposition. Right? This is just following that basic formula. S is P, right? Subject is predicate. And then we've got a third proposition. All dragons are really cool animals. Now we try to draw out what are the premises and what's the conclusion. And we see the premises are the two propositions. All really cool animals are logical creatures. All dragons are really cool animals. All right, those are the things that we're building our argument on. And the conclusion is that all dragons must be logical creatures. That comes from those other two premises. And you notice the way Logic Dragon stated it, he actually stated the conclusion first. The conclusion does not have to come at the end. What we mean by the conclusion is just that it logically follows from the other propositions. So let's be really clear about a conclusion. It is the final statement. It doesn't necessarily have to come last, all right? But a conclusion is, how can we put this? It is what the speaker is trying to persuade the audience to either do or to think. Right? That's the conclusion, what we're trying to persuade the audience to do or to think. Now we have this phrase categorical syllogism, and that's what we're really going to be focusing on. A categorical syllogism is a syllogism in which the premises and the conclusion are written in standard categorical form, such as S is P. And once again, we've got our Logic Dragon and our little kangaroo who come back in, and Dragon says, we've already used logic to prove that dragons are logical creatures, so it only makes sense that I take over the next part. And Kangaroo says, and I'll help, since marsupials also know a thing or two about syllogisms. So Logic Dragon says the first premise in a categorical syllogism is called the major premise. And one of its terms will be the predicate of the conclusion. All right, that's very important. We're going to see an example in just a moment, but we just want to make sure we get that definition down. And then Kangaroo says the second premise in a categorical syllogism is called the minor premise. And one of its terms will be the subject of the conclusion. And as you know, I'm a chart kind of guy. I think this stuff fits into charts and maybe it's a little bit easier to remember. So we've got a chart here, and we've got three columns. Right? So in a syllogism, we've got three propositions. The first proposition, second, and third. First proposition is called the major premise. It contains the major term, which will be in either its subject or its predicate. The second proposition is called the minor premise, and it contains the minor term, which is either in its subject or its predicate. Then the third proposition is called the conclusion, and it will contain the minor term in its subject and will contain the major term in its predicate. Now we put a special note here. The middle term is the term that is in both premises, but not in the conclusion. All right, that's the minor, or the middle term. All right, now let's see if we can see this in some action. So Logic Teacher comes back and she says, let's try it out. See if you can identify the types of propositions in this syllogism, as well as the major, minor, and middle terms. And little guy in green says, easy. Even a cotton-headed ninny-muggins can do that. And guy in blue says, yeah, that should be... Hey, wait! Did he just insult me again? And so logic teacher starts off, she says, no dogs are cats. Some cats are tigers. Some tigers are not dogs. The little guy in green says, well, the first premise is an E proposition, right? We know that's a universal negative. The second is an I proposition. And then the conclusion is an O proposition. You might want to look back at your notes to make sure you see that. And then the fellow in blue says, the major term is dogs. The minor term is tigers, and the middle term is cats. So take a look at that. Right? See, dogs is in the first or the major premise, and notice that dogs is then the predicate of the conclusion, just what we said. The word tigers is in the second premise or the minor premise, and notice that it is then the subject of the conclusion. And notice the word cats, that's the middle term, and it does not appear in the conclusion. So that's just a little look at the categorical syllogism. We're going to be doing a lot with that, so we want to make sure we fundamentally understand the structure of the categorical syllogism, and we'll be back to talk more in our next video.